The red carpet ceremony on the Buckingham Palace forecourt had been rehearsed down to the inch. Lines of tourists pressed against the black railings, cameras raised above their heads. A stiff breeze rattled the flags above the palace gate. Then came the break in the script. Donald Trump, a step ahead of his aides, slowed, frowned at the formal route toward the palace entrance, and jabbed a finger toward a smaller side gate closer to the motorcade. "Open that one," he said, loud enough for the press microphones to catch. "That's a direct order." The tourists nearest the railings turned at once toward the lone scarlet-clad figure beside the smaller gate, Sergeant Ewan Hart of the Coldstream Guards. Hart did not stir. His white-gloved hands remained closed on the butt of his rifle. His eyes, fixed over the crowd at a ceremonial distance, didn't flicker. The hush that spread across the forecourt was so sharp that even the muted click of a photographer's shutter carried. For a heartbeat, it looked as though one of the most powerful men in the world had just been ignored by a soldier standing at attention. No one yet guessed what that stillness was about to reveal. From the balcony above the forecourt, the press pool's cameras pivoted as one, lenses tracking the unexpected moment. In the front row of the tourist crowd, a boy lowered his souvenir flag. His mother put a hand on his shoulder, whispering something he didn't quite hear. Trump had taken 2 deliberate steps toward the smaller gate. Behind him, his chief of protocol, a seasoned diplomat with 30 years in the Foreign Service, moved in quickly, murmuring, "Sir, the ceremonial route is—" "Don't lecture me," Trump cut him off, jabbing a finger at the gate again. "That one's faster. Tell him to open it." But Sergeant Hart still didn't move, sir. The rifle at his side stayed perfectly vertical, his chin high, his eyes locked on that invisible point above the horizon the guards are trained to fix on. Word spread along the line of onlookers that something unscripted was happening. People shifted forward, phones rising higher. The buzz of chatter died down to the quiet rustle of coats and camera straps. An older man in a tweed cap, a visitor from Yorkshire, and a veteran of the Falklands, muttered to no one in particular, "That lad's not deaf. He's standing his post. You'll see." At the far edge of the cordon, a palace aide spoke hurriedly into a radio. Ceremonial precision was meant to prevent scenes like this, scenes in which protocol collided with personality in full view of the world's press. Yet nothing about Hart's stance betrayed even awareness that he had just become the focal point of hundreds of eyes and several live news feeds. For tourists, used to seeing the guards as a motionless backdrop to photograph, the refusal to react to a foreign leader's command felt at once unreal and strangely magnetic. A soft-spoken reporter from a European news outlet, standing on the press rise, muttered into his mic for the live feed, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is highly irregular." The guard at the side gate appears to have ignored a direct instruction from the visiting head of state. Near the railing, a little girl on her father's shoulders asked, "Daddy, why won't the soldier listen?" Her father only shook his head. "Because that's not his boss, sweetheart." The tension in the air settled thicker than the cool London wind. Something everyone sensed was about to happen, and no one could guess which way it would break. The usual rhythms of a state arrival, the whir of camera shutters, the low murmur of broadcasters describing the scene, had given way to a strange, taut quiet. The breeze stirred the flags above the gates. Otherwise, the forecourt seemed frozen. Trump squared his shoulders and advanced 2 more steps, stopping just inside the line where the forecourt gravel met the ceremonial carpet. His aides hovered a half-pace behind, uncertain whether to intervene or step back. "You," he said, pointing a finger at the motionless figure. "Open the gate, now." Sergeant Ewan Hart didn't so much as blink. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point above the crowd, the posture of ceremonial readiness unchanged. Trump's voice sharpened. "Soldier, I'm giving you an order." The only sound that followed was the soft hiss of the wind across the forecourt stones. Phones in the front row tilted higher. Several visitors lifted them above their heads to record. Somewhere to the left, a camera crew whispered hurriedly, trying to frame both men in the same shot. The hush was deep enough that the faint clatter of a cavalry horse's bridle from the far end of the yard sounded unnaturally loud. An aide, thin, bespectacled, accustomed to diplomatic nuance, edged forward and murmured quickly, "Mr. President, The guard reports to his own chain of command. This isn't... Trump waved him off without turning. I said, open it. I'm not asking. Behind the president, a pair of uniformed palace stewards exchanged wary glances. They had seen many things on the forecourt over the years. Awkward handshakes, poorly timed salutes, even the occasional protester. But they had never seen a visiting dignitary attempt to command a guard on post. Hart remained immovable, a figure carved out of the moment. His white-gloved right hand rested on the butt of his rifle. His left stayed perfectly aligned with the seam of his tunic. The faint sunlight caught the brass of his buttons and made them glint against the deep red wool of his coat. The silence lengthened until it began to feel like a held breath. Near the railings, a man in a dark overcoat, himself a retired Royal Marine, muttered, "Hold the post, lad. Don't give an inch." The cameras kept rolling. Then, in that carrying voice that needed no amplification, Trump tried again, the words coming out harder this time, clipped and unmistakable. "That is a direct order from the President of the United States." It was the kind of line that would have had subordinates snapping to attention anywhere else. Here it was met by perfect stillness. No flinch, no glance, no acknowledgement. The tension deepened until even the tourists who had been whispering fell quiet. And in that silence, the world watching through 1,000 phone screens and a dozen live news feeds realized the test unfolding in front of them. One man wielding political power, the other holding fast to a rule older than either of them. To the crowd, Hart looked like a statue in red wool and white leather, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. But inside the discipline of that posture, his mind was steady, not blank. He had held posts before that were far less ceremonial and far more dangerous. On a winter night in Helmand Province, he had once stood in the open doorway of an armoured vehicle for 6 unbroken hours, scanning the dark ridgeline for signs of movement while the convoy repaired a damaged axle. The cold had numbed his hands. The radio crackled with tense reports from other units. When a nervous private had asked how he could just stand there and not fidget, his sergeant had answered quietly, "You don't serve the man. You serve the post. The post is where you draw the line. You hold it. That's what the uniform means." Those words had stayed with Hart through every guard shift at Buckingham Palace, and were with him now. Protocol was not a nicety to him. It was the spine of the duty that separated soldier from political theatre. Until relieved by a superior in his own chain of command, he stood that line. The presence of cameras, the weight of a foreign leader's command, even the knowledge that the incident might become a headline within the hour, none of it mattered. Through the corner of his vision, Hart registered the movement of a breeze, lifting the edges of the visiting dignitary's overcoat, the bright flutter of a child's flag, the polished brass buttons of his own tunic. He had trained himself to notice without reacting. He had learned that sometimes the hardest part of a soldier's job was not the fight, but the stillness, to wait, to hold, to give nothing away. Somewhere near the front, a woman whispered, "Why won't he do what he's told?" An older man beside her shook his head. "Because he's not his guard, he's the king's." The explanation was quiet, almost reverent. Hart stood unmoved, calm as a man under oath. The wind shifted slightly, and the faint echo of a cavalry horse's hooves came across the stones. He focused on the invisible point above the crowd and let the moment pass over him. Whatever came next, he would not move until properly ordered. The weight of the moment pressed down on the forecourt. Even the camera shutters grew cautious, clicking in slower bursts as if afraid to break the silence. Trump stepped closer, close enough that the sunlight caught the fine weave of his blue tie. His expression had shifted from his usual public confidence to something sharper, the set of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice lower but edged with steel. "I'm telling you, move aside, open the gate." The tourists and press behind the barrier leaned forward unconsciously, as if they could feel the unseen line being tested. Some of the reporters instinctively raised their microphones toward the two figures, hoping to catch every word. For the first time, Hart's lips moved. His voice was not loud, but it carried, steady and measured, the kind of tone that could be heard even over the crackle of a radio in a war zone. "Sir, I act only on the order of my commanding officer." There was no defiance in it, no trace of personal challenge, only the clarity of a soldier stating the boundary of his duty. The words seemed to ripple across the crowd. A veteran near the front shifted his weight and gave a small approving nod. A palace footman, watching from behind a column, let out the breath he had been holding. The journalists exchanged quick looks. They knew they were witnessing the kind of unplanned moment that could dominate headlines for days. Trump's head tilted slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe he had been answered that way. His jaw tightened. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he demanded. Hart did not so much as blink. The parade ground stillness held. A soft voice broke the tension. A child's voice, puzzled and curious. "Why won't the soldier listen?" The words carried just far enough to be heard. Around the child, several adults fell silent, their phones low. The question seemed to hang in the air, unanswerable yet perfectly framing the scene. Power demanding obedience, discipline refusing it. Trump took another half step forward, closing the distance to just beyond arm's reach. "Listen, soldier," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "When I give an order, I expect it done." Hart's eyes remained fixed on that invisible horizon above the crowd. His reply came in the same even tone. "Sir, my duty is to the post until I am relieved." The respect in the words made the refusal more striking. It was not a personal contest. It was a soldier doing what the uniform required. A ripple of murmurs passed through the onlookers. The international press correspondents knew enough of protocol to understand the implications. The guard was in the right. A woman in a dark overcoat, a retired army nurse, whispered to her companion, "He's holding the line. That's what he's supposed to do." A few tourists slowly lowered their cameras. It was no longer a moment to collect as spectacle. It felt more like something to witness. The cameras that stayed up caught the stillness. A president with the weight of political power in his voice. A soldier standing immovable, refusing not out of pride but out of service. A gust of wind stirred the flags on the palace roof. The crowd watched, silent, as the standoff held. Every second deepening the sense that they were seeing a tradition being tested in real time. For a heartbeat, even the seasoned journalists weren't sure how it would end. For a long moment, nothing moved. Even the tourists who had been murmuring and shifting their weight seemed to steady themselves, as if the entire forecourt had fallen under the same discipline as the soldier on duty. The onlookers' faces told their own story. Near the front railings, a grey-haired veteran wearing a blazer with a small campaign medal pin rested both hands on his walking stick. His lips moved silently as he watched Hart's stillness hold a tea. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but those closest to him heard it. "That's what service looks like." A few steps away, a young couple, tourists from California, lowered their phones. The woman shook her head slightly, leaning toward her partner. "I thought he was just a ceremonial guard. It's like he's rooted there." The man nodded, his voice hushed in reply. "That's real discipline, not an act." 2 rows back, a palace staffer in a dark overcoat watched from the shadow of a column. Her job normally kept her behind the scenes, unnoticed. Now her eyes stayed fixed on Hart, her expression quiet but proud. The sort of pride that comes from seeing a standard upheld without fanfare. A small boy in a red jacket tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, why won't the soldier listen to the man?" The father hesitated, then crouched down to answer in a tone the boy could hear, but others nearby caught too. "Because that soldier isn't here to follow just anyone. He's there for the post. That's his job." A little further along the barrier, a British Army reservist stood with arms folded. He had come to the palace out of curiosity, never expecting to see a moment like that. His jaw set with professional respect. Beside him, a television journalist lowered her microphone slightly and muttered to her cameraman, This is going to be the clip everyone replays." From the second-floor balcony of the press enclosure, a senior correspondent tapped out a quick line to his editor. "Forecourt standoff. Guard refuses presidential order. Crowd frozen in silence." The weight of the moment grew heavier, not because of any show of force, but because of what everyone now understood. The stillness was not obstinacy, it was duty. And that realization shifted the mood from curiosity to respect. Phones came down. Conversations faded into hushed tones. Several tourists removed their caps as if entering a place of ceremony. In the centre of it all, Sergeant Hart stood as he had been trained to, motionless, eyes fixed forward, unshaken. A few steps in front of him, the visiting president stood with the unmistakable look of a man who had never before had his authority held in check by a rule he could not bend. For the first time since the exchange began, the balance of the scene was no longer between two men but between two principles, command and duty. The crowd could feel it, and their faces, solemn now, respectful, reflected that they knew they were watching more than a public confrontation. They were witnessing a line that had not been crossed. For a few long seconds the standoff held, two figures locked in silence at the centre of the forecourt, the crowd holding its collective breath. Then the heavy side door beneath the palace balcony opened with a measured swing. A man in dark service dress strode out across the stones, his boots making crisp, even sounds that carried in the still air. The gilt badge on his peaked cap caught the sunlight. This was Warrant Officer Blake, senior duty officer for the Guard that day. He moved with the calm authority of someone accustomed to difficult situations. He halted a measured distance from the two figures, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a sharp salute. Not to the Guard, but to the visiting head of state. "Mr. President," he said, his voice clear, steady, and respectful, "welcome to Buckingham Palace." Trump turned slightly, sensing a shift. Here at least was an officer who had acknowledged his position. "I gave an order," he said, his tone clipped. "That soldier ignored it." Blake's reply came without haste, his posture as precise as his words. "Sir, Sergeant Hart was carrying out his duty exactly as required. While posted at this gate, he acts only under orders from his commanding officer. Until I relieve him, he is bound by that duty, and he has done so correctly." The explanation was calm, professional, and left no doubt as to the chain of command. A slight frown creased the president's brow. He looked past Blake to Hart, still standing immovable, and then back again. "So, you're saying," he was right not to obey me." "Yes, sir," Blake answered evenly. "While on post, he answers only to his own command. That is the protocol of this court and has been for generations." A ripple of quiet recognition passed through the onlookers. Several who had been unsure now understood. The refusal had not been a slight, but an affirmation of the rule. Trump's lips pressed into a line, not quite a scowl, but an expression of a man unused to being checked. He shifted his weight, as if deciding whether to press the point further. Blake lowered his salute and turned slightly toward Hart. "Sergeant Hart," he said in the tone of an officer issuing a formal order in full view of witnesses, "you are relieved." Hart's posture changed in a single smooth motion, the subtle shift of a professional soldier coming out of Guard's stance. He took one precise step aside, brought his right hand up in a perfect salute, and held it for a heartbeat. Blake returned the salute with equal formality. The small exchange, barely 3 seconds in all, carried more weight than any argument. It told the crowd, and the cameras recording every angle, that discipline had not bent to personal command, but had been released only by its proper authority. The president glanced once more at Hart, then at the now open side gate. Something in his face suggested the moment had registered, even if he said nothing. With a short nod to Blake, he turned back toward the red-carpeted route and continued as the protocol officers guided him. For a moment, the entire forecourt seemed to exhale. A veteran near the front lifted 2 fingers smartly to his brow in an informal salute. A young palace footman murmured, "That's how it's supposed to be." One of the foreign correspondents tapped a quick note into his phone. "Protocol triumphs over personality. Crowd silent as officer relieves guard." Hart lowered his arm, stepped back fully from the post, and followed his superior in measured silence toward the guardhouse. The red wool of his tunic and the brass buttons caught the sunlight as he moved, the discipline in his bearing unbroken. The crowd, which had come expecting the usual ceremony of a state visit, now stood subdued, having witnessed something else entirely, a lesson in the weight of duty. As the president moved on along the red-carpeted route toward the palace entrance, the forecourt slowly regained its breath. The moment had passed, but the atmosphere had changed, as if a line no one had ever seen tested before had just been drawn and held. The crowd that had been leaning forward a few minutes earlier now stood a little straighter. Phones were still raised, but fewer were recording. Many just watched in silence, as if unsure whether to applaud or simply bear witness. Near the railing, the veteran who had murmured his approval earlier shifted his walking stick to one hand and raised the other in a slow, respectful salute toward the retreating figure of Sergeant Hart. No words, just a small gesture of recognition from one serviceman to another. A palace footman, standing discreetly by the gate, let out a quiet breath and whispered to the colleague beside him, "People will talk about this for years, not because of what was said, but because of how he stood." A television journalist, lowering her microphone, muttered to her cameraman, "First time I've ever seen a visiting leader outranked by a rule." The cameraman nodded, still filming the last glimpse of Hart as he stepped back behind the guard line. In the crowd, a father rested his hands on his young son's shoulders and spoke softly. "Remember that, son. Sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is stay still." A woman with a small Union Jack folded it and tucked it under her arm, eyes lingering on the red tunic figure retreating toward the guardroom. Across the press barrier, a correspondent from a foreign network muttered as he typed into his phone, "Headline writes itself, power bows to discipline." By the time the president's party disappeared beneath the portico and the palace doors closed behind them, the earlier tension had drained from the forecourt. In its place was a kind of quiet respect, not for the confrontation itself, but for the steadiness that had diffused it. Several tourists who had arrived expecting nothing more than photographs of the famous changing of the guard found themselves lowering their cameras altogether. A few exchanged nods with strangers beside them as if they shared an unspoken understanding. For the rest of that day, the forecourt looked no different than usual. The flags still moved in the breeze, the ceremonial lines stood ready for the next rotation. But those who had been there knew they had witnessed something unusual, a test of protocol that had revealed the steel beneath the ceremony. One of the journalists, leaving the press area, murmured to a colleague, "I came to cover a handshake. I'm leaving with a story about the weight of a post." The evening light slanted low across the palace courtyard as the ceremonial guards were rotated out. Inside the guardroom, the hum of the day's events seemed to fade with the closing of the heavy door. Sergeant Hart sat at the long wooden table, methodically cleaning his rifle as he had done countless times before. The faint scrape of the cleaning rod and the soft click of metal against metal were the only sounds for a while. The door opened and Warrant Officer Blake stepped in. He carried no air of formality now, just the easy authority of a man who had seen his soldiers through more than one difficult day. Blake took a seat across from Hart, resting his cap on the table. For a moment he said nothing, letting the quiet linger. Finally he spoke in a tone that was neither congratulatory nor stern, just steady. "Half the world probably saw what happened out there today." Hart didn't look up from his work, running a cloth down the barrel in smooth, practiced strokes. "I only stood my post." Blake allowed a faint smile at the reply. "That's exactly the part they'll remember." Hart glanced up briefly, his expression calm, almost matter-of-fact. "Protocol isn't personal. If you start making it about who's giving the order, you lose the meaning of the post." Blake nodded slowly. "That line you held today, people needed to see it. Not for the news, but for the principle behind it." Hart set the rifle aside and began to fold the cleaning cloth with precise corners. "Most won't remember my name. That's as it should be. The post matters, not the man." Blake studied him for a moment, then rose and settled his cap back onto his head. "Still, you did the regiment proud today. Get some rest, Sergeant. Tomorrow the post will be waiting." Hart gave a small, respectful nod. "Yes, sir." Blake left the guardroom, his footsteps receding into the corridor. Hart turned back to his kit, the quiet discipline of the task unchanged. Outside, the last light of evening faded over the palace, and the forecourt stood as it had before, a place defined not by the day's confrontation, but by the constancy of those who held the line. If you'd been standing in that crowd, would you have wanted the guard to obey the president's command or hold his post as duty required? Have you ever seen calm discipline turn a tense moment completely around? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every one, and your stories often inspire the next videos we share. If you value true-to-life stories about the Royal Guards, moments that show what service and tradition really mean, make sure to hit like, tap subscribe, and click the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's upload. Share this video with someone who thinks the Guards are just for show, because what happened today proves there's far more behind the uniform. And as you do, take a look at the other stories now appearing on your screen. Each one reveals a moment when protocol, discipline, and respect shaped history in ways you might never have expected. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place, with another powerful story.